Everyone, welcome to my channel. My name is Marina, and as always, it's exciting to come to you in another video. If you're finding me for the first time, welcome. My name is Marina. I live in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, and on this channel, I share information to make settling into life in Canada seamless for newcomers and foreign trained professionals. If you're interested in content like this, please do well to hit the subscribe button and join the family. If you're a returning subscriber, I appreciate you. Thank you for always coming back to watch my videos. In today's video, in the spirit of truth and reconciliation, I'd like to acknowledge that I am making today's video from Saskatoon, which is Treaty 6 territory and homeland of the Métis people. This is one of the commitments that I'm making to myself going forward, to include a land acknowledgement in the description box of all my videos going forward. For those of you who are confused about what just happened, like what is a land acknowledgement? A land acknowledgement is used to pay respect to the original owners of the land that I now have the privilege to call home. I can call Canada home because the original owners, which is our Indigenous brothers and sisters, were generous enough to extend the hand of fellowship and hospitality to welcome us to this land that we now share and call home. So this is one way of paying respect and acknowledging the work that went into the people who have come here before we have, the people who came ahead of us, and we now have the privilege to call Canada home. I know that my content basically talks to newcomers, but the newcomers I'm talking to today is everyone who identifies as a first generation immigrant and our interactions with the Indigenous people in Canada. There's a lot of misinformation out there. There's a lot of misinformation that's been handed down, and I think it would be fair for us to stop and talk about this. So that's what today's video is about. So I'll share a bit of my initial impression when I first moved to Saskatoon. My first interaction was a bit awkward. Like the first mention of an Indigenous person, the impression that I got was, okay, something is going on there and nobody wants to talk about it. So I asked, I'm like, okay, what is it about Indigenous people? And nobody could give me an answer. What was handed down to me was there are people to avoid, you don't want to mix with them, you don't want to live in the areas they live in. In fact, there's this huge misconception that people should not live in certain parts of the city just because there's high concentration of Indigenous people there. That was the first impression that was handed down to me as a newcomer in Saskatoon. Every time I asked, it was like everybody that I tried to ask, they would look away. So of course, at that point, settling in, finding a job and just getting by was my immediate priority. But it was something that always tugged at me. Like, what is it about these people that nobody wants to talk about? But yet we have been advised to avoid them. So when I went to school, my classroom was like my first close interaction with people who identified as Indigenous. And they were very nice, very sweet, warm, homely, just very warm people to deal with. It was in the course of that education that I first heard about Indigenous history in Canada. And some of the things I heard were shocking. In my interaction with Indigenous people in school is where I first heard the history of the residential school system in Canada. Now, if you're a newcomer who's genuinely curious, there's so many resources online that you can look up to learn more about the history of the residential schools. But for the purpose of this video, I'm going to be doing a very quick summary. I would include any resource that I find online that would be useful to this conversation. I would include that in the description box, so do well to check it out. So the residential school system, from what I got to understand, was like a boarding school system that Indigenous children were literally forced to attend. Some of them were as young as 3. They were taken away from their parents, in some cases forcefully taken away from their parents and enrolled into these residential schools because the Europeans who managed those schools at the time wanted to teach them new language, wanted to teach them a new culture, wanted to teach them their own ways of doing things, and literally erased their own identity, for the lack of a better way to explain it. These children were taken, enrolled into the schools, their names were changed and they were given numbers. I think for me, that's the most heartbreaking part of that story. You take away somebody's name and give them a number. Can you imagine calling somebody number 11? Like, that became their identity, number 11. Remove their names. They taught them a new language, so they were losing touch with their own original culture, taught the new language, changed their names, created just a whole generation with identity crisis and trauma. And in those residential schools, they were not properly treated. There were people who were abused in every sense of the word, abused. Some of them were sick. They died in the residential school system. The ones who eventually made it back home after the residential school system ended were so out of touch, they could no longer speak their language. They had identity issues. They could no longer connect with their own community. And of course, when there's that kind of void, when it comes to like identity and things, you will use vices to fill it up. So most of the things that we're seeing today that we say, oh, Indigenous people are full of trouble, they are always known to cause trouble, and providing this history so you will understand where that stemmed from. Like when you take away a whole generation of people, take away a whole generation of values, things that could not be handed down, you create a void in the handing down of history and legacy within a culture for some people. What exactly do you think will happen? That's exactly what we're seeing today. That's the history of the residential schools. That's a summary of what it was that happened. It was horrible. It was horrible experiences. There are some people who are alive today who were in the residential school. So it was not that long ago. From my understanding, the last residential school closed in 1996. That's less than 30 years ago. So there are people who are alive today who are telling firsthand their experiences with this residential school system. The 30th of September every year has been set aside as the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation as part of measures to make peace, to make amends because of the consequences and the effects that the residential school system had on our indigenous brothers and sisters. So September 30th has been set aside. It is the Orange Shirt Day, where everybody, the orange shirt is used to depict the children who were in that residential school system. It was also used to honor the children who never made it back home. For the children who were sick, who were abused, who died in the residential school system, the Orange Shirt Day is what we use to honor them. So you see me wear an orange shirt today, it is in honor of the children who went through those systems, the ones who never made it back home, and just standing in allyship with our indigenous brothers and sisters. Now, the reason why I'm calling this out with first generation immigrants, especially newer immigrants, is that before you begin to run with the stereotypes that have been handed down, before you start to run with all the things that you have been told, I need you to take a moment to step back and ask yourself the whys. If they tell you that these people are trouble, you need to avoid them, I want us to start to get comfortable questioning some of these things. Why? And the first thing that you need to do, my first call to action to all of us fellow immigrants is to educate ourselves. Educate yourself. There's so many resources that are available online. CCDI, the Canadian Centre for Diversity and Inclusion, has a lot of resources if you're interested in learning about Indigenous history. For some people, it's as simple as going to your library. Go to your library. There are resources that are available there that you can read up. There are links online that you can read up. There are so many resources. If you just Google Indigenous history in Canada, you will see so many things that you can use to read and get your additional context as to why some things look the way they look. Waniskewe Museum is another place where you can just go to go and look at, understand history. There are people there that you can ask questions to say, hey, I have questions about this. I'm curious. I want to learn more about this. There are programs, there are lessons they provide just to help people understand the history, the history being told by the owners of the culture. Because it's one thing for another person to tell your story. It can never be the same as if you are the one telling the story. For me, I recently had the opportunity to go through my first ever blanket exercise. A blanket exercise with Indigenous people is basically using blankets to depict their history. The blanket exercise was used to depict how communal they were, how free they were as a people, and when the Europeans came, how welcoming they were. They shared their lands, and little by little by little by little, the lands that they were allowed to occupy became smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. Imagine inviting a visitor into your house and the visitor takes over the house and begins to give you rules on how you should be living in your house. The visitor depicts for you where you can go and where you cannot go, what you are allowed to do and what you are not allowed to do. The visitor tells you what language you are allowed to speak in your own house. That is the basic depiction of what it was and what happened. By the time that blanket exercise got to the residential schools and having people tell the story of how that residential school system was, how the 60 scoop was, I'm giving you guys all of these keywords so that you can go and search it up and read. The 60 scoop was just it was like the residential school system, where people were yanked from their parents and taken to other places and given new identities, and it became just a generational problem. Read about all of these things and see. By the time that blanket exercise got to this part of the story, there was not a dry eye in the room. Just thinking about it, like I've heard about Indigenous history, I've learned about Indigenous history, but see it depicted like that. In fact, it was like a movie that we were all in. We were all in the exercise, using people in the room to depict what the history was and how it happened. And guys, it was first of all, I was very humbled that I had the opportunity to be a part of that exercise. But then it provided perspective that I would never have had if I was not a part of that exercise. So my call to action to you today, my immigrant brothers and sisters, my first generation immigrant, is to call out your own biases. The misinformation that we have run with is a whole lot. I'm not blaming you. I know that this is not information that's readily available except you go searching for it. But I'm calling you today to say, go search for that information. Go and check the history of these people who graciously welcomed strangers into their land, and it has turned out to be what it is. But the reason why you and I can call Canada home today is because that sacrifice was made years ago. So educate yourself, read about the history, call out your own biases. If you're more of a visual person where you prefer to watch, there are so many movies on Amazon Prime, there are movies on Netflix. The one I watched a couple of years ago, and you guys, that movie made an imprint in my heart. It's called They Were Children on Amazon Prime. There's another one called White Picket Fence. You might find that on YouTube. I'm not very sure what platform I saw that on. These movies I found to be really helpful to provide like a visual depiction of what life would have been like at that time, like taking children away from their families. Like I have two children who are under the age of 12. I cannot imagine what life would have been like if somebody came to my house and yanked away my 5-year-old child from me to go and register them in boarding school, to go and register them and teach them a new language and give them new identity and create crisis. I cannot imagine what the trauma would have been like for the parents who were at home. I cannot imagine what the trauma would have been like for the children who went through those systems, came back home and could no longer fit in. I cannot imagine that. So just imagining that a whole generation of people went through that and we expect them to be fine. No, that's not how it's done. You cannot flog somebody and teach them how to cry. And that's for some of us who say, oh, but this thing happened years ago. Why haven't they moved on? If you were in that situation, would you be able to move on? I'm talking about a residential school system that happened less than 30 years ago, and we expect that people should be fine by now. There are people who are alive today who went through that, still dealing with the aftermath of that experience, and we expect them to just get up, dust themselves and move on. It doesn't work like that. So for those of us who that's our stance to say, but they have been giving them money, the first question I want you to ask yourself, do you think that for this kind of problem, do you think that money is the solution that is needed? Have we stopped to ask our Indigenous brothers and sisters to say, what exactly is the help that you need? How can we make that happen? Read. That's why you need to talk to Indigenous people. That's why you need to talk. Sometimes you cannot just hold on to everything you see on the internet. It is perspective. Talk sometimes. The Indigenous people have a lot of elders who, if you meet them anywhere and you ask questions, best believe they will stop and explain things to you. So be on the lookout for programs like that. The local library we advertise. These settlement agencies, they typically have programs where they invite like Indigenous elders to come and share a bit of history. When you hear about programs like that, attend and just get that perspective and see. Call out your own biases, and you cannot do that if you do not educate yourself. You cannot do that if you're not informed yourself. So inform yourself, educate yourself. Another way that you can show support is to find Indigenous-owned businesses and support them. Find Indigenous-owned businesses, look around your community. What is Indigenous-owned? In what way can you show support? In what way can you support those businesses? In what way can you create some kind of economic empowerment that empowers our Indigenous brothers and sisters? Show support. That's how to be an ally. Have those conversations within your circle. When you hear people in your circle talking down on our Indigenous brothers and sisters, those conversations that are mainly stemmed from an ignorant perspective, call it out. Call it out. Let's begin to hold ourselves to account to say, we're here today because somebody opened the door. We're not now going to come here and then just join the stereotype and brandish them and label them and say not to be mixed with, and then you carry on your business like everything is fine, when the actual owners of the land are actually not fine. So guys, Tomorrow is September 30th. It is the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, where we honor everyone who was a victim of the residential school system, for the people who never made it home, for the people who made it back home and have to live with the trauma of everything that they had to deal with in that system. We honor them. That's what the orange shirt depicts. So in any way you can show support, in any way you can be an ally, begin to find those ways and be an ally. Let's stop with the stereotypes. Let's stop with the ignorance. Let's stop with the misinformation. If there's anything you're not sure of, ask questions. If there's anything you're not sure of, do some research, read, educate yourself. To our Indigenous brothers and sisters, I stand with you. I stand with you. This is the little way I can lend my voice to this conversation is what I'm doing right now. And if you know of any Indigenous owned businesses in Saskatoon and you see this video, please leave it in the comment section. As many businesses as we can support, we will be open to that. If you have ever heard anything about Indigenous people in Canada, please share that in the comment section. Let us educate ourselves. The education starts from here, and I don't want you to be afraid to admit that you don't know. It's okay not to know. Well, now you do. So please go and do some research, inform yourself, educate yourself, and we're going to do better from here. Well, thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you learned something from it. If you did, hit the subscribe button, leave a comment below. What can we do better? What do you think? What is your call to action? What are you going to do better from here going forward? Please share that in the comment section. Let's all learn from each other. Thank you again for watching this video, and until I come your way in the next one, it's Marina as always saying thank you and have an awesome day. Bye guys.